This is Grandmaster Daniel Naroditsky. We're watching Alexander Grischuk face off against Magnus Carlsen at the 2021 FIDE World Rapid Blitz Championships. And they are off. We've got a Nimzo Indian. Nope, we have a Catalan. Grischuk playing very positionally here. Bishop g2. This is a standard mainline Catalan. Let's see which line Magnus chooses. There's so many different lines that Black could choose in the Catalan. Magnus taking a little bit of time here, trying to decide how to challenge Sasha Grischuk here, and he decides to take on c4. Generally, Black doesn't keep that pawn, and once again in this position, there are so many different ways to play. Black can go b5. Bishop b4 check is one of the topical lines, very popular these days. Grischuk covers that with the bishop. Now Magnus goes a5, defending his bishop. Grischuk will probably castle here and might play queen c2 to try to pick that pawn back up. Oftentimes, the battle here revolves around whether or not White is able to get to that pawn on c4 quickly, or if Black is able to cling to it. Grischuk now taking a little bit of time himself. He can castle. He has queen c2 or queen c1. A lot of possible moves here. And he goes for queen c1, attacking that pawn directly. Now, is Magnus going to defend it, or is Magnus going to part ways with that pawn? That is, of course, an extra pawn. So b5 here is possible, but incredibly risky because it opens up a diagonal for White's bishop. So big decision here for Black. This position is already not that theoretical. b6. So Magnus does allow Grischuk to recapture that pawn, but he prepares to get his bishop into b7 or a6. He wants to get that bishop into the game. Now, Grischuk could delay capturing that pawn if he wants, but it seems to me that he's probably going to take on c4 here. He might also go knight e5, exposing an attack against Black's rook on a8, trying to punish Magnus for going b6. No, he decides to take the bishop first, and now he takes the pawn on c4. Okay, that makes sense. Now Magnus's b4 pawn is hanging. He has to defend it. On the flip side, Black has the a file. No, he doesn't have to defend it. He doesn't defend it at all. He gives it away. After queen takes b4, oh, he wants maybe knight c6 and then knight takes d4. There were some tactics there. Grischuk decides not to deal with it. He castles. Now Magnus plays knight c6 to defend that pawn. Black's entire queenside setup looks just a little bit flimsy here. I don't know about this. Knight e5 at some point could end up being unpleasant. First of all, Grischuk has to complete his development. I would imagine knight b to d2 is a natural move here. Magnus does have that a-file and that pressure on the a2 pawn. I think that is Black's greatest asset here, but it looks like White has gotten everything that he wants out of the opening. As Magnus castles, both sides have completed their development. Grischuk getting his rook into the game, rook fc1. Now the knight on c6 can't really move because you're going to lose c7, so Magnus gets his other knight into the center, knight d5. Grischuk does have e4 here. He could chase that knight away if he wants to, but e4 would close off White's g2 bishop, so that would be a pretty committal decision. Seems like a good time to take a think, but Grischuk quickly gets his queen back to c2. He wants to get it out of dodge. Doesn't want knight a5 to come with tempo. Magnus creating some luft with h6. Will Grischuk decide on e2, e4? And he's about to make a move, and it's knight c4. He gets his knight closer to the center, maybe even to e5. Looks like White's got a great position here, better control of the center. Black's got a lot of weak pawns, b4, c7. Those could be pressured by White. This is exactly the kind of position that Grischuk wants. Magnus needs to do something to turn this game around as he leans back in his chair. He doesn't seem too happy with his position here. You can tell by his body language as he twirls the pawn around. How does Magnus fix the problems in his position? He goes rook a7. He might want to go bishop a8 or queen a8. Queen a8 would actually allow him to attack the a2 pawn. Very interesting idea as Grischuk completes the maneuver of his knight, knight e5, and now knight back to e7. Magnus doesn't want to move his knight away from c6 because that c7 pawn is going to end up pretty exposed. Now Grischuk could capture the knight on c6. He could trade a pair. That seems pretty reasonable because the d4 pawn is hanging right now. Magnus could capture it if Grischuk doesn't defend it. Sasha taking his time here. He could take on c6. He could go e3. He decides to take that knight. What is Magnus going to recapture with? He takes with the bishop. Interesting decision. He wants to keep that diagonal open. And e3 by Grischuk, reinforcing his pawn. And queen a8. That was the maneuver started by the move rook a7. And this attacks the knight. This also attacks the a2 pawn. But if Grischuk's knight moves away, then if Magnus takes on a2 in the end, c7 is going to hang. So there might be a lot of exchanges here in the next couple of moves as Grischuk decides where to bring his knight. Knight g5, what a move! What a move! And now Magnus can't take the bishop on g2 because of mate on h7. I think this was missed by Magnus. He has to take the knight, but then Grischuk takes on c6, and it looks like this is leading to a better endgame for white. H takes g5, bishop takes c6. Now a trade seems compulsory. Yep, there we go. Takes c6, takes c6. We might get a double rook endgame, and it looks like only white is having all the fun there with that monster rook on c6, but Magnus's pressure on the a2 pawn could end up being enough for him to secure the draw. First question, will Magnus take on c6? Let's see. Or is he going to keep the tension with a move like rook d8? Can he take on a2? He probably can take on a2 immediately. No, he decides to take the queen, and he's probably going to double rooks on the a file. There he goes. Now, Grischuk cannot defend a2. Maybe rook b1 here so that b2 also doesn't fall. That looks like an interesting move. He could double on the c file himself. Draw seems to be the likeliest result, but I actually think that white has a small advantage here, and Grischuk really good at squeezing stuff out of these kinds of endgames. Rook a to c1, Magnus takes on a2. Now, Grischuk doesn't have to take on c7 immediately, but he does. Rook takes c7. Now, Magnus will probably take on b2. This looks like it's still moving toward a draw. Grischuk is probably going to win back the pawn on b6. After rook takes b2, black will be a pawn up, and black will be threatening to get his other rook to a2. So white is not out of danger either. Let's see what Magnus does. He's hesitating. I thought rook takes b2 is pretty natural here. What is he afraid of? Nothing. He takes on b2. Now, how is Grischuk going to respond to the threat of rook a to a2? Grischuk doesn't seem too happy about that. That was a hard move to see from a distance, and rook c8 check, forcing the trade of rooks. This seems like a pretty dead draw. Rook b8. He's going to win the pawn on b6. And then we're going to have a 5-on-5 with one of the pawns being restrained by white's rook from behind. So the b pawn is not going to be a danger. It's not going anywhere with that white rook sitting on it with rook b6. Magnus goes g4 to freeze white's pawns. Rook takes b6, b3, king up to g2. This looks very drawish, but we know that anything can happen. This is a blitz game. Both sides pretty low on time. There's plenty of game left, and Grischuk could at some point try to push his center pawns. He could play e4, d5, trying to create a pass pawn himself. That's not particularly dangerous as Magnus goes f5. Ooh, allowing rook takes e6? Wait a second, what if Grischuk takes that pawn on e6? That's a very strange decision. Magnus is sacrificing a pawn. Now, after rook takes e6, black's pawn will get to b2, but will it get to b1? That is a very committal decision. Grischuk is thinking, no, he doesn't take the pawn. He goes h3, offering a trade of pawns. Something about that move that he didn't like. King back to g8. Grischuk takes on g4. He can still take on e6 here. And Magnus not afraid of giving up a pawn in a rook endgame. What a committal decision, but Grischuk doesn't seem to want to take it. He might go e4, trying to push those center pawns, as we discussed earlier. No, he takes the pawn. I don't know about this decision from Magnus. Rook c2, that was his idea. Now he's got a pawn on b2, but that pawn isn't going any further. Grischuk, in the meantime, has connected passers in the center. What did Magnus just do? This was a terrible decision by Magnus because he is unable to disattach his own rook from the pawn. Grischuk might win this game. e4, here come his pawns rumbling down the board. Magnus is left with a bunch of weaknesses on the king side. If Magnus doesn't find some way to hold white's pawns together, it's going to be a loss. And if Magnus takes the pawn on d6, then he loses his passed pawn on b2. He does. He has no other choice. Black has good drawing chances here, but Grischuk with a passed extra pawn in a blitz game, this is going to be very hard to defend. He goes f3, and Magnus king f7. Grischuk shouldn't take on g4, and he doesn't. Probably after the trade, it's still a draw, but this is not so easy to defend. There's 2-on-1, and Magnus low on time. He seems frustrated. Will he take on f3? Can't he hold this endgame together? This shouldn't have happened. He shouldn't have given that pawn up, and he seems frustrated. If he moves his king, though, he allows f4, so he has to take the pawn, and he does. King up to f6. Should still be a draw. King f4, g5 check, forcing the king to the side. But now the g5 pawn is a big weakness in itself. That's a lot of concern, and rook stays on the fourth rank. Grischuk drops his king back so that he can push his e-pawn, gets his rook to the side. He's preparing for a bunch of lateral checks. Magnus has to be very careful not to lose that g-pawn. Is he going to lose that g-pawn? Rook b5 check, and back to f6. Gaining some time is Grischuk. Rook f5 check, forcing the king to the side. But if the king goes to g6, then there's king g4. Magnus is going to lose his second pawn. He loses the pawn to check, and now white is winning. White is up 2 pawns, and this is winning. G and e pawns should be a pretty straightforward win now for Grischuk, as Magnus wasn't able to hold on to his other pawn. King g5. This should be a pretty straightforward win. Maybe rook back to f4. Grischuk, no, he goes g4. He gives up the e4 pawn, but he has got black's king cut off from the king side. Black's king is unable to cross the f-file, and so I think this is a winning position for white. Magnus, you can sense the frustration. Rook to the side, king h5, paving the way for the g-pawn to push. Rook a8. Magnus tries to check from the front, but he's not going to make it, and he resigns. This is a lost rook endgame. Grischuk manages to defeat Magnus from a completely drawn endgame. What a game. If you want more of these, click on the link to the playlist. This was Grandmaster Daniel Naroditsky watching Alexander Grischuk defeat Magnus Carlsen at the 2021 World Rapid and Blitz. Thank you.